Dear friends, in this episode, I want to explore a highly controversial topic starting from my own experience: addiction. Those of you who have watched my live streams may already know that I, too, have gone through periods of addiction in the past. When I was a lot younger, my addiction behaviors mainly took the form of compulsive shopping. I also experienced addiction to scrolling short videos. But the most serious and most obvious period was a specific time in my life when I became deeply immersed in gaming. Looking back on these experiences, I've realized that although the forms of addiction were different, shopping, short videos, gaming, the psychological sensations they produced were strikingly similar. Today, I want to share these experiences and try to unpack the psychological mechanisms behind them in the hope that they may offer some reference or insight for others. The first thing I want to talk about is the sense of contrast and emptiness. This feeling often appears very early in the addictive process. It is subtle and hard to notice at first, yet deeply powerful. Take gaming as example. The game world is colorful and immersive, filled with fantastical senses, achievements, and reward systems that quickly pull you in and provide a strong sense of satisfaction and accomplishment. Short videos work in a similar way. They rely on extremely fast pacing, exaggerated emotional stimulation, and intense visual and auditory input to rapidly amplify and mobilize emotions. Shopping, on the other hand, triggers dopamine through the immediate sense of acquisition and gratification, creating a brief feeling of pleasure. The problem arises when this kind of pleasure stands in sharp contrast to real life. Once the game ends, the short videos stop, or the novelty of a purchased item fades. Real life can suddenly feel dull, flat, and uninteresting, as if its colors and rhythm have dimmed. This sense of contrast and emptiness is a very powerful psychological signal. It unconsciously pushes a person to return to gaming, to keep scrolling short videos, or to shop again in search of temporary emotional relief. This is the beginning of what we might call psychological escape. When real life fails to meet the brain's expectations for pleasure, people begin to look for alternative pathways. These pathways offer short-lived gratification, but they rarely address deeper underlying issues. Over time, this repeated behavior gradually becomes a habit. From a psychological perspective, this is a classical example of operant conditioning. The brain learns which behaviors can quickly bring relief or satisfaction, and the next time stress, anxiety, or unpleasant emotions arise, it automatically reaches for the same behavior to cope. This means that even the slightest pressure in life can immediately trigger the mental image of that escape exit. As this pattern continues, the brain becomes increasingly occupied by these habitual responses. Other priorities are pushed aside. Attention becomes fragmented, and it becomes harder to focus deeply on tasks or responsibilities. At the same time, I noticed that psychological addiction is often accompanied by anxiety and guilt. Each time I become aware that I was once again absorbed in gaming or scrolling through short videos, feelings of self-blame and unease would arise. I knew, rationally, that these behaviors were not truly meaningful or wise. Yet, I still felt pulled along by my habits. This guilt is not merely emotional discomfort. It gradually amplifies at a subconscious level, leading to doubts about one's self-worth and self-control. Why can't I control myself? Am I weak? This self-doubt further reinforces the addictive cycle. because anxiety and pressure themselves becomes triggers for escape behaviors. Let me offer a more concrete example to illustrate this mechanism. When you play a game, you may experience a brief sense of omnipotence. You can complete tasks easily, receive rewards, and even gain recognition from others in a virtual world. This creates psychological dependence. While the real world is complex, slow, and often uncontrollable, the game world offers control and instant gratification. This contrast can make real life feel pale and unsatisfying, and the brain gradually becomes conditioned to seek out what it perceives as a more efficient source of pleasure, even if that pleasure is short-term and virtual. Short-form videos operates in a similar way. Within just seconds or minutes, you experience intense emotional fluctuations. This kind of stimulation is often more concentrated and extreme than anything encountered in everyday life. Over time, attention is trained to crave high-intensity input, while the calm, slow, and incremental nature of real life becomes increasingly difficult to tolerate. Shopping addiction reflects another variation of the same psychological dynamic. When buying something brings pleasure and satisfaction, dopamine is released, forming a conditioned response. The problem is that this satisfaction is extremely fleeting. Once the novelty of the item wears off, the sense of emptiness returns. As a result, people keep purchasing, trying to fill an inner void with material acquisition. This mechanism is fundamentally similar to gaming or short video addiction. Short-term pleasure is used to relieve long-term psychological gaps without addressing the underlying emotional needs. Through these experiences, I gradually came to realize that addiction is not only physiological, it also can be deeply psychological. I have never used the drugs, but I have personally experienced the reality of psychological addiction. I believe this is a widespread condition in modern society. In a fast-paced, high-stimulation world, whether through the internet, entertainment, or consumer behavior, similar mechanisms of psychological addiction can easily emerge. Although these behaviors may not act on the nervous system as direct as certain substances do, they can still profoundly affect one's emotional state, self-control, attention, and mental well-being. Looking back, my understanding of addiction has become much clearer. Addiction is not just about the pleasure of a single act. It is a process of long-term psychological depletion and inner tension. At its core, addiction is the brain's dependence on high-intensity stimulation, combined with repeated tendency to choose short-term escape over long-term growth when facing stress and emptiness. Over time, this pattern erodes one's sense of self and sense of reality, gradually diminishing the feeling of being in control of one's own life. Fortunately, I was eventually able to recognize and change these patterns. I no longer engage in any form of gaming. I manage my finances rationally, and I am no longer addicted to scrolling short videos. This transformation did not happen overnight. It requires long-term reflection, disciplined practice, and the establishment of new habits. Looking back now, these experiences helped me understand how addiction works, why short-term pleasure often conceals long-term costs, and why so many people struggle with addiction in real life. I truly realized that the long-term mental cost of addiction is often far greater than its short-term rewards. Addiction drains our attention, emotional stability, psychological resilience, and sense of self-mastery, resources that are essential for personal growth, healthy relationships, and a meaningful, fulfilling life. Understanding this is crucial for all of us. Whether we are facing addiction to shopping, gaming, the internet, or any other form of psychological dependency. In modern society, temptations are everywhere, and it is very easy for us to fall into these cycles without even realizing it. Precisely because of this, it becomes even more important to learn how to observe our own behavior pattern and to recognize the tension between short-term pleasure and long-term cost. Addiction itself is not what is most frightening. What is truly dangerous is our unconsciousness and numbness towards it. Only when we are able to consciously observe our own psychology and behavior and understand the mechanism behind them can we truly regain freedom and a sense of agency. My experiences helped me to develop a more realistic understanding of addiction. Addiction is not simply a bad habit or a lack of willpower. It is a psychological phenomenon that requires understanding, awareness, and self-regulation. Understanding addiction is also part of understanding ourselves, our minds, and our lives. It reminds us that genuine growth and fulfillment do not come from relying on external stimulation, but from cultivating patience, focus, and care towards ourselves and towards real life. I want to emphasize one thing. Having experienced addiction is not shameful, nor does it mean that you have failed. What matters is whether we are able to become aware of it, learn from it, and adjust our behavior so that our lives can return to a path of autonomy and clarity. It is precisely through such awareness and practice that we can maintain psychological health in modern society, receive clear consciousness, and participate in relationships and life in a responsible way. Now, I'd like to discuss something even more important. I often hear a statement that sounds reasonable. Anything can be addictive. Love can be addictive. Exercise can be addictive. Enjoy food can be addictive. So, if we reject anything simply because it can be addictive, should we just stop doing everything altogether? In fact, relational non-duality does not deny that anything, once it enters the relational network between human being and the world, can become imbalanced. What it clearly points out, however, is that not all relationships carry the same level of risk, and not all forms of addiction arise through equivalent mechanisms. From the perspective of relational non-duality, life is never composed of isolated things, but is manifested through continuously interacting relational fields. Health and imbalance never originate from an object itself, but from whether relational tension remains within a range that can be adjusted and restored. Love, exercise, and eating are not problems in themselves. On the contrary, they are essential dimensions through which life unfolds. Moderate exercise strengthens the coordination between the body and its environment, making the body more resilient and responsive. Appropriate eating nourishes the body and its energy systems, allowing life to continue. Healthy love is a flowing relational state. It allows each person to become a space in which the other's life can unfold. In this state, relationships are mutually nourishing. They are not one-sided extraction, but dynamic regulation, not compulsive repetition, but natural flow. However, once quantity becomes uncontrolled, the nature of the relationship changes. Excessive exercise shifts from training to depletion and can even become a form of violence against the body. Overeating turns nourishment into burden, disrupting metabolism and balance. When love becomes extreme, it shifts from care to control, from intimacy to precision. In relational non-duality, this turning point is crucial. Imbalance is not simply a bit too much, but a transformation in which participation turns into grasping. Once a relationship becomes grasping, it ceases to flow and becomes fixed in a single direction. And this is precisely the essence of addiction. Many people mistakenly believe that addiction simply means liking something too much or needing it too strongly. But from the perspective of relational non-duality, the true hallmark of addiction is this. The relationship loses its capacity for self-correction and return to balance. At that point, a person is no longer using an experience, but is being pulled by it. No longer participating in a relationship, but being dragged by it. This is why the harm caused by addiction is always twofold. Psychologically, emotional regulation weakens, and one becomes dependent on external stimulation to maintain stability. Physiologically, the nervous system, endocrine system, and reward circuits are continuously reshaped. This is also why relational non-duality must clearly distinguish that not all potential addictive things belongs to the same risk category. Some substances are extracted, synthesized, and consumed precisely to generate extreme state of consciousness, emotional peaks, or sensory rupture. They are not slowly integrated into life's natural rhythms, but instead bypass regulatory mechanisms and forcibly produce high-intensity experiences. The pursuit of extreme experiences itself is already a warning sign on a relational level. It bypasses regular learning, weakens self-regulation, and strengthens dependence on peak states. The problem with this path is not whether the experience feels real, but whether it damages sustainable relationships with oneself and with the world. Therefore, what relational non-duality emphasizes is never asceticism or fear, but the spirit of the middle way. The middle way does not mean doing everything a little less, but allowing relationships to retain a flexible space in which they can be filled, adjusted, and restored. When we practice the middle way, we do not make pleasure the sole goal of life. We do not treat pain as an enemy that must be escaped, and we do not turn any particular experience into a salvation. We begin to learn how to coexist with the fluctuations of life, rather than constantly creating stronger stimulation to cover up imbalance. As I mentioned in the previous episode, we are not only participants of life, but also guardians of the relational network. Every choice we make influences our own physical and psychological structure. The way we interact with others and the direction in which this world is being shaped. When we safeguard relational balance, we are not only protecting ourselves, but also protecting the web of relationships that allows life to continue and coexist. Relational non-duality ultimately does not point toward fear or negation, but toward a deeper sense of responsibility. Responsibility toward ourselves, toward others, and towards the world. And true freedom arises naturally from this clear, gentle, and sustained guardianship. This is also why I consistently oppose escapism. No matter how poetically, mysteriously, or so-called spiritually escape is packaged, its essence does not change through beautified language. Escape cannot solve problems. Even if the form of escape is an extraordinarily beautiful and moving dream, it is still only a dream. When we wake up, causality still exists, relationships still exist. And if the source has not been addressed, the problem will not disappear. Relational non-duality is not a theory of feelings, but an uncompromisingly honest understanding of the structure of reality. Within this understanding, Causality is not a religious doctrine, but the natural result of relational continuity. Many people feel fear as soon as they hear the word karma, as if it were some kind of mystical judgment mechanism. But in relational non-duality, causality does not come from outside, nor does it judge you. It is simply the natural extension of our relational state. If a problem keeps repeating, it is not fate trying to make life difficult for you. It is because the relationship with oneself has not been seen. The relationship with others has not been repaired. And the relationship with the world has been distorted or neglected for a long time. As long as the relational structure remains unchanged, the results will inevitably reappear again and again in different forms. This is not punishment. It is a reminder. That is why escape never works. Changing environments, identities, experiences, or even states of consciousness will not help if the relationship itself has not been repaired. Causality will simply migrate along with you. Escapism is often misunderstood as self-protection. But from the perspective of relational non-duality, a more accurate description is this: a refusal to participate in the process of relational regulation. When we escape, what happens is not that the problem disappears, but that the problem is temporarily pushed deeper. Relational tension is postponed rather than released, and our capacity for self-regulation is gradually weakened. Over time, people may even develop a fear of returning to reality itself. It is not that the reality is too cruel, but that we have gone too long without practicing how to remain grounded within relationships. This leads to a very direct yet crucial conclusion within relational non-duality. If all problems arise from relationships, then the only reasonable path towards resolution is to repair and rebuild relationships. Cutting off relationships freezes problems instead of resolving them. Escaping from relationships merely displacing tension instead of transforming it. Repairing relationships, on the other hand, means something entirely different. Facing one's true self again, relearning how to coexist with others, and readjusting one's place in the world. This path is not exciting, not fast, and not stimulating, but it is genuinely sustainable. It is important to clarify one point in particular. Repairing relationships does not mean forcing oneself to endure everything, nor does it require maintaining all relationships unconditionally. Repairing relationships begins, first and foremost, with restoring an honest relationship with reality. This includes acknowledging one's fears, vulnerabilities, and confusion, recognizing one's responsibilities and blind spots within relationships, and letting go of the illusion of safety maintained through avoidance. True repair often begins with discomfort, but it does not end in repression. It is precisely for this reason that I decided to continue this series. When I first began addressing this highly controversial topic while streaming, you would see a very clear state of me: uncertainty, hesitation, and inner conflict. That was not because I lacked a precision, but because I was genuinely weighting responsibility. I knew that once certain words were spoken, they would no longer be just opinions. They would have real impact on others. Escaping, in fact, is an easy choice. Hiding value, staying silent, avoiding controversy. These were all options available to me. But in the end, I chose to face the issue because I knew very clearly that if the problems I perceived were real and I chose to avoid them, then my relationship with myself, with my audience, and with this relational field itself would all be distorted. Courage is not emotional confrontation, nor is it linguistic aggression. True courage is sustained participation amid uncertainty, honesty within complexity, and the willingness to take responsibility even when one may be misunderstood. Continuing this series is not an act of opposition towards anyone. It is an act of enhancing my relationship with responsibility. When a person no longer relies on avoidance to maintain psychological stability and is willing to gradually regulate relational tension from within, that in itself is already a sign of maturity. What relational non-duality ultimately points toward is not a single correct answer, but a way of living, a way that chooses to stay, to participate, to repair, rather than to constantly escape. I do not believe that I have done everything right. Of course not. I am still learning, still adjusting, and I will still make mistakes. But at least on this point, I am clear. Escape cannot bring freedom. Only participation can. And so I will continue walking on this path, not because it is easy, but because it is real. And reality is precisely where relationships begin to flow again. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next episode.